Hi there and welcome to this, the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. Thank you very much for joining us on the show here today. For those of you who are new to the show, very quickly, what's the show all about? Well, the show's really all about helping the security community understand and get insights into raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an appropriate organisational culture where security is truly valued. For those of you who are repeat listeners, thank you very much for joining us back here on the show. It's great to have you back here. So what is it that we're going to be covering today? Well, in series 1, I had an interview with this guest, and I mean, all the interviews with guests are absolutely fantastic. But this interview was really interesting because it's somebody that I've admired for years and was a core part of a lot of the research that I did into rethinking the human factor. Well, most of the guests are in some capacity or other have been involved in terms of, for me, in terms of research. But one of the things that's been really interesting is, I had the interview with this guest, and then later on in other interviews that we've had with other guests, they kept referencing back to this particular guest's work and his father's work, which has now been going on for over 40 years, 40 years of research into culture, both at a national level and an organizational level. So this guest is Gert Jan Hofstede. Him and his father have been monumental drivers in terms of our understanding of the role of culture within society, but at a national level and also at an organizational level. But also, I think one of the interesting things about his work is, the understanding that even the choices you make career-wise, the professions that you might follow, schools, etc., these are all major influences on our culture. And it's been a really big eye-opener for me when I started doing my own research into the human factor 6 years ago. So it's great to have Gert Jan Hofstede back on the show. So without further ado, let's get on with the interview. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. And today we have a returning guest from, probably, 12 or 11 months ago. So you made a promise to me a year ago, and I sort of left it for 10 months. And I came back and I was like, let's hope, keep my fingers crossed, you can spare the time to come on. And here you are. I'm really grateful. Thanks very much for joining us on the show.
You're welcome.
So when we last spoke, one of the things that a couple of the listeners picked up to me was that you and I were having a bit of a poke and a laugh about Brexit and looking at it from a very cultural perspective. And we explored a whole range of other things as well. But today, here in the UK, the Prime Minister returned from Brussels with the revised version of the exit or Brexit deal. And tell you what, I don't think it's going to go through, I really don't think it's going to go through. I'm just reading stuff and picking stuff up and I'm like, oh my gosh, here we go.
Did you see Juncker actually presenting the revised version?
No.
Okay,
No.
Well, he was quite belittling to May, saying, yes, you got a second chance. That's what we do in politics. There won't be a third chance. So he actually made it clear that, he didn't really want to be nasty, but he felt that this wasn't really changing the situation so much.
Ah.
I don't know. If you look at the letter, it seems that the English have now an opportunity to get rid of the backstop after a certain time, if they want, without the agreement of the EU. But this doesn't seem to lead to a stable situation. Anyway.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens tonight, and I tend to share your feeling. And why is that? Because this is mainly a very Anglo or English or British ritual, which is the fight. So when there's a match going on, then the match is very important. You shouldn't disturb it until the match is over. And this whole Brexit thing has turned into a match. So the context is gone. Everybody should shut up and enjoy the match, because this is really good. Who will win? Who will lose? I mean, that's so important here. And it was that way from the start. I suppose there was also some male chauvinism against May involved, and there were some big egos involved. But the whole thing that you forget about everything else and just concentrate on the match between the political parties and within the political parties, That's very British. So some people in Europe have said, like my compatriot Leyendijk, have the Brits gone mad? Well, they haven't. They're just having a match. They're having good fun having their match.
Now, the listeners here are going to go, well, why are they about cybersecurity? I said, well, one of the important things for us on this podcast is that it's the lessons that we learn from other things outside of cybersecurity that are really important, I think, to shaping how we might want to change things. So one of the reasons why, if you're listening, when we're talking about Brexit, it's like, actually, this is all about, there's a fair amount, if not everything, is about the cultural dimensions at play here, the cultural forces at play. And I think what you were just talking about there is, from a British perspective, it's the sense of a match. And it's like it's part of the game and somebody's going to win at the end of it. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes, and you don't want spoil sports who pretend that they are arbiters or they want to stay outside of the game. Yeah, these people are worthless. You want to take sides, bet on the match, things like that. That's life. That's fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you think that the Brits are unique in that within the European context? You don't think that the Europeans have that sort of we want to win type of view? And I guess the other question for me is, can two people win? Or is that a draw?
I think no, Bruce. The question is, are we in a match, or are we in a long-term collaborative relationship, or are we in a long-term competition, or are we in a network filled with obligations and complementary roles? In the Anglo society, all of these are not true. We're all independent individuals. And the good thing is to be calm and manly and original and a winner. Mm-hmm. And it's not a good thing to be something else.
That's within the Anglo sort of cultural societies.
Yes. So in Europe, you have England and Ireland that they're a little bit different. Ireland is more egalitarian, so they don't support somebody lording it over them. In England, this is quite less the case. But on the whole, Europe has many different parts that have very different cultures. Only from the insular perspective of England, it looks like one big thing, Europe. From on the continent, you can see all kinds of differences. And actually, my country, the Netherlands, have a fair bit common with the English Isles. Not for nothing. We have Saxons here. You are Anglo-Saxons. So we've a shared history of colonization. And in part, the Dutch are rather similar to the English. But we are much more inclined to get out of the idea that we have a match and to look beyond it. Which also means that from an English perspective, the Dutch could be seen as the spoil sports.
Right. Okay.
Which we could be. So, and all these things, actually, they transport to every aspect of society, including cybersecurity. So in cybersecurity also, you'd be likely to see the English considering things to be a match between whoever happens to be protagonists at the time. And the Europeans, on the whole, are more likely to say, okay, guys, we need to collaborate. We have different responsibilities and loyalties and deals that are not here for the moment for these partners. No, they are embedded in a larger structure.
Okay.
And so there is ample ground for misunderstandings, also because the words that we use to talk, including you and me now, they take on a different meaning in a different culture. So the same word of match even, or value, or rules of the game could be ambiguous. It's quite a tricky issue to talk about. If you talk to somebody who doesn't have a readiness or a wavelength to want to talk. Some people, I think, are not made to reflect on culture.
Yeah, I think that's probably a really good point to peel off and to talk further. I think one of the things that I always remember when reading some of your work was the importance of recognizing that we don't even recognize our own cultural biases.
It's actually really devastating sometimes that I, who I'm supposed to really know better, make these stupid errors, in forgetting about culture or forgetting about appropriateness. And then sometimes later I realize my error, but probably often I don't. So yes, it's very difficult to be to be a human being and reflect not just on your behavior, but about the culture that causes you to respond in a certain way.
So do you think it's, in many respects, that's the first thing? I mean, when I think about people that are listening to the show and those that aren't even listening to the show, who've been given the responsibility for looking at culture, maybe they've got culture in the title. So this is not unusual now. Increasingly, I'm seeing this in job titles within our industry where they'll say security culture.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Yeah, safety culture. I actually have a PhD working on that.
Okay,
that is very specific because this is in heavy industry in South Africa, where there used to be so many casualties. I mean, a life was cheap. But that has changed. So they have all these safety systems in place now. But as you can imagine, there is still the issue of communicating. And what do you do if you're an operator of a machine room and something seems to be out of the ordinary? Do you go and report to your superiors? It depends on what they will do. If they blame you, well, maybe you just keep silent, If they reward you, you'll probably go and do it. If you don't understand the importance because you're kept stupid, then you probably will do the wrong thing. So there are all these elements in which the social and the technical system are dovetailed in their everyday dynamics.
Yeah.
This is. So it can make sense to speak about culture, but it could also just be a catch-all term or a scapegoat term. And you can see both usages of the word culture happening.
So does it mean it's really important to understand if you're being given the responsibility, maybe you're health and safety manager for a manufacturing plant or a mining plant, for example, in South Africa or any other country in the world, okay, and one of your responsibilities is culture. How important is it before you even accept that job to understand what your employer, your future employer, means by culture? Because it seems to me, in all the research I've done around culture, those are different meanings. You've almost got organisational type of culture. You've got the culture which is maybe more associated with sort of an anthropological background. National cultures. Like, how important is it to getting to grips to what you actually mean with culture before you even start on that journey of being the health and safety manager?
Well, I would say that you can get part of the way by just being a perceptive, socially very skilled person.
Right.
Because that will mean that automatically, without necessarily knowing the words for it, you will get a number of things right. You will notice that a relationship in a certain department, maybe the safety department, are not good. That a boss is not committed and people are not talking to the boss, for instance. You don't need to know the word culture for that. But if you want to go further than the operational situation and you want to make policy and create a good architecture in an organization, then, of course, it helps a great deal if you have a conscious mastery of the concept of culture as something that is embedded in the unwritten rules of the social interaction between people and can only slowly and often only half purposely be changed. So nobody can change the culture of England. Forget it.
Yeah.
But you could change the culture of a British company, certainly if you start greenfields through the personality and the practices of the founders and the internal institution in their organizations that they create. That is why organizations differ in their organization culture. It's a flowering field. But even that is very difficult. And once, suppose you take over the company, you see that there is a lot of fear of management and people are hiding stuff. They use pocket vetoes to sort of say yes, but do no. How can you change that if you're the new boss? That's very difficult because there are ingrained patterns of behavior that people are only half conscious about. Yeah. And each measure that you take can itself, in the wrong context, be taken as confirmation that things are wrong. Yeah. So it might actually be almost impossible for you as new leaders to act, which is why sometimes you see people just closing off a plant or closing a division and starting afresh.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the last point that you were making, which was around the policy and architecture side, though I think that and then we'll come back to what we've just been talking there about. Mm-hmm. You can't change the culture of the UK. you can change the culture of an organization, but it's really hard work. But if we go back to the policy and architectural piece and the importance of understanding culture there, it's almost like by understanding culture, it's almost it then becomes a design principle for the architecture within an organization. Is that a way of demonstrating it?
I would say that, again, if you are, let's say, if you live in a wider societal culture that's rather homogenous, people understand one another, then you never have to talk about culture, because all these things about having a good atmosphere in the company, having trusting relations, you will do them without needing another layer of consciousness. But as soon as you start hiring Polish people in your plant in the Midlands, well, you do have to think about that, because there will be a different implicit social structure in the minds of those new people. So you could very easily achieve a situation where people are not talking to one another, there's distrust, and there are many cases of international mergers where that has happened.
Yeah.
This typically happens when managers say culture is soft business and it's nonsense and we're not having any of this nonsense, which is quite less than, let's say, more than unlikely. It can happen pretty easily in the Anglo setting, in which men are supposed to be manly and decisive. All this blah blah about culture seems to be at odds with that ritual image of a leader, a hero.
Okay.
But it doesn't mean you don't have to be soft to talk about culture. You merely have to be realist and have reasonable empathy, or else just look at the statistics of failure of international.
Yeah, that's the interesting one, is it? Because when you actually get down to the data, and I'm not sure whether or not, I mean, as part of all my reading, it was quite clear that there are examples of mergers and acquisitions that on paper look like they should have worked. But in reality, it's not data that makes a merger or an acquisition work, it's people.
Yes.
And when you get to say, okay, so now I need to understand the people. If you neglect, or even if you have a blind spot to the people angle, then you are really not putting your best foot forward in terms of trying to be a success and make a success of that acquisition or that merger. And this is the thing when it comes back to the importance of culture. That's the point that we were making earlier, is that if people don't even recognize their own cultural biases, the fact that they are influenced by their culture. So the point you were making is that it's not conscious within us.
Yeah, well, the point is, if everybody has the same bias, well, then it's not a bias.
Yes.
Okay, it's common knowledge or common understanding, or it's implicit.
Yeah.
But as soon as that differs between people, then it can start to be a problem.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be between. The difference doesn't have to come around as a result of between different nations. So an organization that merges with another and suddenly finds that it's got 6 different offices in different countries that it's never worked with. I mean, that's obviously an opportunity for a cultural, I think the phrase that does get used is clash. So I always think of cultural clash as almost quite negative. It's for me, it's almost like it's just a different cultural shift or paradigm. Because there is no good or bad when it comes to culture. It's there can be clashes, but there can also be sort of more sneaky misunderstandings that aren't really conceptualized as such. For instance, you might say you're in the English company and you say you just can't trust these frogs because they are not frank or whatever. So it tends to get cast as a person or an individual issue rather than a culture issue. And if you start to blame individual people for what is essentially cross-cultural misunderstanding, then that will be bad for trust relations. And you won't learn anything about the cultural differences. Yeah.
So actually, you could end up never wanting to work with the French again, for instance, as a Brit, or the other way around, for the wrong reason. Yeah. You thought they were untrustworthy. They were quite trustworthy, but for their own country people.
Okay, so this brings me into a question for the role of interpretation. I think one of the things we talk about is how you need to be able to observe other cultures. So by recognizing the existence of culture and the influence it has upon even you as an individual, there's almost okay. So if I've got my culture, if other people I'm engaging with have got their culture, it's first there's the recognition, then the second point is it's about actually observing it so that you can actually take it on board. And I remember in one of the books that you wrote, then there was the issue of interpretation. And and is that what you were sort of alluding to just then? You know, you have an experience of working with somebody and you interpret the way they're engaging with you or responding to you in a way you think, oh, that's sort of like negative, and you take that away with you, and you then basically frame that. Anybody who comes from France, you have this frame in your mind. You have an experience with one person, then you apply that to absolutely everybody who's from that particular culture.
Exactly, that could easily happen, and you can imagine why this would have actually evolutionary advantage. You don't want to spend time closely identifying all the little details of every creature you meet. So very quickly, there's a tendency in the human mind to distinguish between this is my group and this is not my group. And in the first case, you're attentive to complementarities, differences, and so on. In the second case, for the outgroup people, you don't want to do that. You want to quickly categorize, and that allows you to take action. And of course, in a world that is dangerous, you need to take that action. Yeah. And this is actually very well exemplified by sports that are so popular in England. So the fact that you have two sets of very different clothes for the two teams is sort of the iconic in-group, out-group case. And you really know who's with you and who's not with you. And actually the Brits are very good at that, you know, having a division in groups for the occasion. It's amazing.
It's like, so what you're talking about there is you've got an away strip and a home strip for football or for yes. What? Yes. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to take you back to the point you were just making about how through evolution, there was a point in our evolutionary past where we needed to make decisions quickly, and there were those people who were within our group, and we therefore had trust with, and therefore we sort of probably were more relaxed with. And then there were those people who weren't in our group who we didn't have trust with, and that probably brought along with it a degree of anxiety. And it's interesting because I just come back from Brussels where I was presenting about how evolutionary progress within humans had actually was actually making us vulnerable in this day and age, because the brain arguably hasn't evolved as quickly as the amount of information and the environment we're living in. And one of the things we sort of came back to was the how the brain evolved to address shortages in energy, which food and energy. There's a relationship that goes on there. So because there was inconsistent levels of food, that meant we had inconsistent levels of energy. And when you have energy is what the brain needs to be able to process information. And that if you're cognitively thinking things through, really having to think, is this somebody I trust? Is this something I'm familiar with in terms of movement, or is it something I'm expecting? That takes a lot more energy. And the problem with that is that if your energy levels are inconsistent, then physically, what you're looking at is the brain's trying to survive. It's like, how can I save energy? And then it develops this other side of the brain. So you've got the system 1, system 2, and the side of the brain that just makes very quick decisions. And it makes very quick decisions.
That was already there, of course. We didn't have to develop that.
Right.
I mean, all mammals have that. And many other non-mammals too, you know, very quick decisions.
Very quick decisions, yeah. That's right, yeah. But in a way, what you're talking about there from a cultural perspective was that sense of, if these are people within my group, I've got less to worry about. I can trust these people. And yes. These were just very quick decisions. Whereas, and in a way, I guess it's the same with the football strips you're talking about, is like, well, you know, this is the away strip. I'm in my home strip. I'm amongst my home fans.
Yeah.
You have that bond that's going on around you, including all the shouting, etc. as well.
So what the English are very good at is accepting somebody as part of a team in a very quick and, you might say, opportunistic way. And like Virgil van Dijk, he's Dutch, but he very quickly became adopted by Liverpool fans.
Right.
And they have this, what is it? He can pass the ball, calm as you like. He's Virgil van Dijk. He's Virgil van Dijk. I think they have this old Dubliner song or Liverpoolian song for it, and I mean that's admirable. So they're not saying this is really a continental,
Yeah.
No, he's Virgil van Dijk. He's good because he is Virgil van Dijk. So that is really, I think, an admirable side of the English propensity to go for matches. If you are on a team and you're good on the team, then that's it. No questions asked. Whereas in many other places in the world, you might have this idea, wait a minute, you're from the continent, are you loyal to our team? But that's not the case in football in England. Actually, I think all across the world, there is this tendency for football players to be loyal to the team in which they happen to be. But I know that in the Dutch national team, we've sometimes had episodes where race was an issue.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'm not aware of that having happened in the on the English team.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, this is a bit of an aside, but so you were talking evolution, which was interesting.
Yeah. So it's one of those things, and sometimes when I was just hearing you talk about there, and that need, has culture evolved to enable us to address this deep down concern, anxiety about the unknown?
I think, yes, I think you're right. I think if you look at our history, the main issue that we faced for the last 2 million years is climate change and lack of numbers. So there was always a need to move.
Right.
Often within 1 or 2 generations. And there was a need to become familiar with people that you didn't know in order to reproduce with them so that genetic heterogeneity could be maintained. And many human populations have actually died out.
Right.
So there was a big premium on getting along with strangers.
Yeah.
And also on being able to find new sources of food. So we are the ultimate omnivores.
Yeah.
And that for sure has much shaped our abilities and our what the biologists call fission-fusion dynamics.
Yeah.
So we form groups and we split groups. And typically we form groups when there are a few of us and we need to defend ourselves against, the weather or foes. And we split when things are going well and we start to have competition internally in our groups.
And I think this is something that's quite interesting because what we're talking about here is survival.
Yes.
And when I've been speaking to people from more of a neuroscience background, there's been a couple of people that come on the show towards the end of last year who focus more upon neuroscience and its role in terms of change and also in terms of learning and development. And one of the things that we keep coming back to is that the brain really has this core purpose, which is to survive. Uh-huh. And that's where I sort of, the whole thing about the brain surviving around energy. So it's like it needs energy to survive itself, but that enables then the whole body and the whole human concept to be able to carry on. And then what you're talking about there is that it's almost like we're driven to move on, and we're driven because through survival. And it could be that the area that we're currently in as humans has actually become overpopulated, can't sustain us anymore, so we move on. Or maybe the area that we're actually living in actually has become too dangerous to live on for anyone, so we've all got to move anyway. And that when you move to new areas, then you suddenly come into contact with others. Now, as a result of coming into contact with others, there's a degree of uncertainty with that contact. Are they friends? Are they foes? Mm-hmm. Fight, flight, type of things going on. But also then there's a sense of learning, which I think is a core part of what culture is about as well. You observe what they're doing, and that's enabled them to survive, and you can then use that as knowledge. You become aware of how they've done that, and that then influences your behavior in terms of knowing what foods when to get the food, what things not to, to take part in.
Yeah.
But then by having those shared, just those shared day-to-day practices, you have a commonality. And then that commonality is what also helps you come together. Sometimes you're driven together by the absolute necessity to survive, and sometimes you come together because of the social connection between you. You start to see that actually, and this was one of the things from your early books that I do really, really take away, the sense of you had this phrase. It was something like, it's not. I haven't got this absolutely right, but basically what was being said was that we are different, but we all have these common life experiences.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Yeah, there were like 5 of them. What were they? Identity.
I don't know what you're referring to now. Identity, this is precisely something you can choose. So identity, you don the shirt of Liverpool, well, you have the Liverpool identity and everybody can see it.
Yeah.
But I think if maybe you will remember if I say something in between.
Yeah.
You talked about coming together. The poignant thing is that sometimes we don't come together when we should. I just read Michael Palin's book Erebus about the Northwest Passage explorer ship that froze in the ice, and some of the people on it have survived for 3 winters in the mid 19th century,
Right.
18 something. And finally everybody died in a most horrid way, and Inuit people that were questioned about it by later explorers actually talked about cannibalism. So it must have been really, really horrible. What Michael Palin then says is he asked the question, how can it be that these people on the ship did not learn from the Inuits how to find food? And so, and it reminds me also of the Scandinavians in Greenland that lived there for a few centuries, finally died out, and also were not ready to eat the same stuff as the Inuit. They actually insisted on having cows, which was also, cows were also on the Erebus boat when it's bullocks were on the boat when it left. And this is something that I use in my recent models that I make. So the separation between groups. Do you stay in a group or stay out? Or do you join a group or don't you join? And this, I think, is a key decision also when you talk about safety and security, or when you talk about organizations. So does your heart allow you to form a group with somebody or not?
Yeah. I mean, you were just giving that example of the in Greenland and the Airbus scenario, and it just makes me wonder whether the drive to survive. You would think the drive to survive is sufficient enough that people would overcome their own. Whatever the barrier was that stopped people looking at how the natives, the locals, were actually surviving. You would think that they could learn from that. We could survive if we did what they do, because clearly they are surviving in some capacity or other. So you would think that was enough. But is there something? It's almost. I know from a behavioral science perspective, they would call it the status quo bias, where in effect people stay rooted to doing what they normally do until it gets to the point where it's a disaster.
Yeah, there is a status quo bias. That is true. And it could be through anxiety or habit. But there's also the thing that every group, the members of every group have to think that that group is better than other groups, or they wouldn't stay in that group if they felt empowered to leave.
Right.
So it's a simple evolutionary outcome.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay. So eventually,
if you think that the Tories are better than Labour, well, you won't vote Labour, will you?
Yeah, there is that. Though you never know in politics.
If you're really a political creature and you're actually in it for yourself, then you're going to surf on the political parties, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I did want to go back. Now, this is a point I wanted to go back to this, and then we took another route, but that's normally what happens whenever we have great guests on the show. You said we can't change the culture of the UK, but you can change an organisational culture. But it's very, very difficult.
Yes, the best way is to start a new company or a new division. So if you have something that doesn't work, mending it tends to be very, very difficult because there are so many ingrained things. If something has been, let's say, undesirable for some time, there are lots of little ingrained patterns. They are like, I use the metaphor of elephant paths. So they are like symbolic, if not literal elephant paths of behavior that you don't really know are there. So rather than try to mend that and change that, and people still taking the path they know, the elephant path they know, you start something new, and that has one big merit already, which is that in any new group, people will be on their best behavior because they want to be in good standing in the new group. This is very natural for people. This is also a new kid on the block phenomenon. New people in any group will be very helpful because they want to achieve good standing. So you create a new organization, you get that effect. And you can see it also in the big tech companies. Apple has had it, Google has had it. So these companies can, for quite a while, Starbucks has had some of that. They can maintain this image. We're new, we're good, we're clean, we're pure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But what about,
of course, so that there you can see that in organization culture, there are also certain, not really laws, but tendencies for certain developments over time.
So that was one of the things that came from my research as well, is that sense of depending on where an organization is in its sort of its history, if you want to think about it, there are going to be different sort of cultural. There are probably certain cultural profiles, and things are driven differently. I think one of the interesting things that I came across was the role of how an organization grows, and how initially it starts off with leaders, and then as it becomes successful, those leaders become more distant from where the majority of what's going on is going on, and where the majority of the workers are, and then you get managers in between, and actually the difference between a leader and a manager when it comes to setting the cultural direction, providing the example, and this was something that came from reading Cotter, who specialises in change management. And I thought one day I'm going to have to introduce the two of you, because a lot of what he was saying in his books, I was thinking, I've heard something. There's a connection between these folks going on. But that sense of an organisation, depending on where it is on its journey, will have a different sort of cultural makeup in a way. But can I ask?
Yes.
So it's easier. So you've got a greenfield site, new tech company. But what about for those people? Majority of the people that listen to this podcast are going to be working for organisations that they don't have that luxury, but but they've been given the chalice of, can we look at how we can either A, influence the existing culture, or B, now this is the one that I struggle with, but I'm open to your view on this, develop a security culture, which sounds to me like developing a separate culture. Can you have a separate culture? Should you have a separate culture?
Well, in order to answer that question, we should deconstruct culture a little bit. So you have below the water, you have the deep issues of what configuration of a social group is natural to you. Do you want hierarchy? Do you seek asymmetry in social relations? Or do you seek symmetry? So will bosses be expected to be authoritarian or be expected to be consultative? And some other variables pertaining to the deep culture. So the security culture will be a child of this deep general culture, just like all the other aspect cultures in your organization.
Right.
For instance, the security culture, if you have a hierarchical society, the importance of seniority and age will be just the same as it will be in the lunch culture or the reward culture or anything else. But, of course, if you go away from this deep level of what you could call values or deep culture, and you go to the practices, then you talk about activities, rituals, symbolic activities, heroes. Heroes are people who are praiseworthy for what they do in the company. Those visible manifestations will, of course, be different in different subdisciplines.
Right. Okay.
For instance, in security, I would expect that there might be a big premium on appearing to be undisturbed and not anxious.
Okay.
But there could also be a premium on having really black stories of crime and fraud and white powder poisoning the organization or what have you. So depending on the aspect culture that you're talking about, whether it's safety, security, reward, work ethos, and so on and so forth, you'll have different practices that come to light, but the underlying values will still be there. And so if you only focus on the practices, like for instance, remuneration, reward, or career management practices, then you might actually be reinventing the wheel for different aspects of the organization. It is also possible that you have an organization that is quite disjoint in that different aspects of the organization are actually taken care of by people from different provenance. You see that in countries with lots of immigration. It strikes me, for instance, in the Netherlands, that there tend to be quite a few people of Turkish background in security-related jobs.
You mean physical security-related jobs? Is that
yes, things like customs check and quality check, identity check, things like that. And of course, in part, this could have something to do with the fact that they have had youths and family cultures in which these elements of security were important. So they deem it's important. They like to do it. They think it's also praiseworthy to have those kind of jobs. And whereas your typical Kentish Englishman wouldn't be interested in such a job. Okay?
Yep.
They would want to have a creative job. That's how they can show that they are somebody.
Okay. Can I just pull you back to the deep dive around the values piece, because you were using a couple of phrases there, which maybe sort of brought up the flag about the values dimensions work that you've done and you and your father have done. Can you just explain to the listeners when I say values dimension, what we mean by that, so that they can understand when you're saying about that deeper dive around values and values-driven culture? Okay, what that means.
So the word values has had a very strong evolution and has had many usages over the last century. So as it is being used by my father in his original works in 1980, it meant things like good and bad, clean and dirty, healthy and unhealthy, safe and unsafe. So values are sort of bi-directional qualities.
Okay.
And dimensions of value, which are the things that societies distinguish themselves in, they highlight some of these values. For instance, in England, being clean or dirty is not a very big deal. Being manly or unmanly is a big deal.
Right.
Being masculine or feminine is also a big deal. Being proud or cowardly is a big deal in England. So these are values that enhance the individual in the moment.
Right.
Whereas if you go to, let's say, China, to put really an opposite example, pride is certainly important, but loyalty and obedience are more important, usually. So in order to be a good citizen, you have to be obedient to the leader, if there is a leader at the moment. Now they have a very respected new leader, Xi Jinping, since a few years. So being loyal to that leadership is very, very important. And so it means that values, they give you a sense of what matters in life and what you live for. That is often very hard to put into words. So, for instance, an Englishman might just as well say, my country is important as a Chinese, but it means something very different. In England, there's a Britannia rules the wave kind of pride. They're ready to pick a fight. In China, it's much more cautious and long-term oriented and obedient. In England, loyalty is something much more fickle, and there could be a big show of loyalty to England. But let's see what happens in the coming years with the United Kingdom or Great Britain or the various islands or the sub-nations such as Scotland and Wales.
Yeah.
It's actually quite unsettled, and everybody knows that is the way. There are dynamics and matches. In China, this is much less so. So it's hard to put into words. That's what I'm saying. With the value thing, you have to sort of take a quiet moment, sit down, and try to deconstruct what's below the things that people say. And you can be a patriot for very different reasons with very different values. Now, on top of that, the word has been used in a different way. If you take value statements from companies, certainly in the Anglo world, typically the word values means convictions. So it's things that you know that you find important. So for instance, you could say, we value honesty.
Yep.
And well, actually, I think that's a very desirable quality. But in terms of culture, what it connotes is we have an individualistic culture. Because in a collectivistic culture, honesty might be very impolite, undesirable, or even undermining. So it might be that the bigger cause of loyalty to the group forces you to not say things or to say things that are actually not true, knowing quite well they are not true, but it wouldn't be appropriate to say these truths.
So things like it's like whistleblowing.
That's a very good example. And actually, even in England or in the Netherlands, a whistleblower typically does not meet with the praise. It's a very good example, Bruce, that he would merit. Typically, whistleblowers are seen as a threat to the group, and there's this instinctive, repulsive response, often very painful and also very shameful after the fact. So very often after the excitement is gone and the whistleblower has committed suicide or is otherwise removed, because they often end up killing themselves. It's so bad. In the Netherlands, we have several recent cases. After everything has passed, then you will find new leaders of the group saying, oh, we are very sorry, we shouldn't have done this, this should never happen again. But there is a lot of emotion involved. And it has to do with the group versus the individual.
Can I just ask a question on that whistleblowing one?
Yes.
It's that when somebody's blowing the whistle, so to speak, often what you find is that you get a lot of people around there will actually, in their heads, saying they've done the absolute right thing, but failing to actually verbalise their support for a whistleblower. And I sometimes do wonder whether or not that's part of the stress that comes with, that affects whistleblowers, post them, doing what really is probably in the interest of society, is then they don't get that support, do they?
Well, I suppose the dynamics could be different also between your English experience and my Dutch experience. But yes, there is certainly, for those that stand around a whistleblower, there is the issue of loyalty to the status quo or loyalty to the interests that the whistleblower represents. And so you have to have a pretty dispassionate, wide vision and loyalty to society in order to support a whistleblower for something else than just a personal relationship.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know about personalities of whistleblowers, but I wouldn't be surprised if, on the whole, people who are very agreeable and tend to like everybody are less often a whistleblower, just because, it doesn't come to them. Even if they don't like what they see, they are more likely to start to reason with people in a friendly way or try to convince them. And so whistleblowing also probably needs some kind of a motive of having been wronged in an organization.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a boss who's repeatedly not listened, and not just not listened, but also insulted you. That's when you start to have a motive.
Yeah.
And I think that the mix between the interpersonal level motives and the larger good in society is particularly difficult in the cases of whistleblowing.
Right.
It's always possible to adopt a perspective to justify various causes, various loyalties.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a question? One of the things that I often come across when speaking to people is that within the context of cybersecurity, we really want people to report incidents. Now, often these incidents they have caused. Okay. Mm-hmm. And there's this clash that goes on between people suddenly thinking, well, in all the training, my understanding is that if I break the policy, I could be sanctioned in some way, I could be disciplined in some way. Mm-hmm. But then organizations say, but we need you to report that. Is there anything from a cultural perspective about people's willingness to report doing something wrong themselves?
Oh, yes, very strongly. I have for many years, I haven't done it so much lately. I have held courses where I asked people, let's say they are breeding specialists in a plant plant growing company, could be anything else, could be marketing people. I asked them, could you come up with some experiences in your own international life that on reflection you say, I probably made some kind of a blunder, so that we have something to discuss. And could you then interpret that event in terms of the cultural dimensions of Hofstede? And how can you make sense of that so that next time you could take a different course of action? If I do that to Dutch people, they will be quite happy to come up with stories where they goofed it and tell us what they learned from it. Mm. If you do it with the English, they might come up with a story packed as a joke. And it's less likely to involve a real error on their own part.
Right.
If I ask this question of Germans or Italians, they are very likely to say, I never had any problems internationally.
Right.
So defending your own social status and avoiding to be seen as having done something wrong is a very strong motive. And in Dutch society, one of the reasons that the Dutch can be so blunt is that we have very little fear, comparatively speaking, with other societies, of social blundering, which is probably why, the Dutch are not known for being so courteous. And,
it's interesting. When I was in Belgium, and we were having a chat. There was quite a few different people from different nationalities around there, and I was having a chat with someone there, and they said, and he was in the audience, and he'd been asking these questions, okay? And I think some people looked at him like, you can't be asking questions like that. But I could tell because of his accent, I was like, he's Dutch. And I'm like, of course. It just being to the point about it. To some people, it get offended because I was like, it's just been so blunt. And you go, but if you understand that that's the Dutch way, then you just accept it, and then you don't get emotionally wrapped up in it. Where there were people in the audience who were clearly getting emotionally wrapped up.
And so the Dutch reaction to that would be, if you took him to task on that, he would say, but I mean, we need to know this, don't we? We need to understand because things will get better. But the thing is that if you ask these questions in a way that's really offensive, things will not get better. In most parts of the world, they will actually get worse because you're endangering relationships. And you could have achieved similar results by a more devious or more subtle route. Mm. And this is where culture is really at its most useful, to know that similar social results of to take a group in a direction where it should go, have to be reached by different ways, by different routes in different cultures. Do you have to speak to the boss first, or do you have to sort of use third persons? Do you just have to play for time? Do you directly go to people? And in what context can you do that? Do you need to go out for a meal or get dead drunk first and talk the next day? All these things differ greatly across cultures. So yes, but I think there's nothing better than international experience with reflection. So if you have this kind of experience, don't just think, oh, what an asshole this Dutchman was, but try to understand his behavior from his perspective, and you'll probably see that he was trying to be constructive. Mm. While also trying to assert himself, because everybody, whatever they do, wants to be, let's say, doing the right thing for the groups that he or she deems are important. Mm-hmm. Nobody willingly blunders. If they blunder, it's because there are misunderstandings in cultural rules across people or across groups.
Right. So I just think that last 2 minutes where you would is probably the best way to summarize this whole conversation. I think it really, for me, to summarize what you just said there is about, these things are at play. They are.
But your poor listeners now, they've listened for an hour and now.
No.
It's just about these 2 minutes.
It's just about these 2 minutes. No, but that's the important thing. One of the things when I talk to people about the podcast afterwards, and they say, sometimes they're like, it's just that they take away a handful of things to go work with, because sometimes I think you can give people so much information, so many things to take away, that then it's almost like information overload. And
yes, that is true. Yeah.
And sometimes I think you just go away with a couple of things and think them through in your own time, in your own space. Have a chat with your colleagues around these things, and maybe just give one or two of them a go. Because in my experience, the times where I failed personally have been where I've tried to get too much off the ground without there getting a couple of demonstrable wins. I mean, the horrible phrase people use is low-hanging fruit. But I think you need to have some success stories around a new idea, a new insight. But to summarize what you were saying, I mean, throughout the whole of this hour, we've been talking about this. These are all lots of insights. But I think the responsibility is upon us in the security profession. If we really do want to develop a security culture or to embed something within the organizational culture and to sort of have a realistic chance of influencing behavior, then you've got to understand the role of culture.
Yes. And depending on whom you're trying to influence, it will work very well for them to really love their leaders and be loyal. So they'll do it out of love. Love is, for instance, a rather important motivator in France. So I've also been in sessions where a French boss asked about what constitutes excellence in management, actually used the word amour. And the workers of that boss will recognize the love for the organization and for themselves and will respond accurately. Now, in England, you wouldn't necessarily use that word. It means something else and in another context. So you would use things like vision or charisma.
Yeah.
Or things like that. So, yes, I agree with that. And maybe a way forward for individuals trying to find their ways in these multicultural environments is if you are in a context in the organization where somebody does something or you hear of something that seems really strange, spend a moment to try and say, okay, what logic would make this behavior reasonable? And that logic could actually be a cultural logic.
I think it's really interesting. Have you heard of Dan Ariely at all?
I think I know who you mean, but I can't say that I know what he said.
So he wrote a book a long time ago called Predictably Irrational. And he's a behavioral psychologist.
Right.
And he came on the show last year. And I think that's part of what you were just talking about. It's that often when something happens and somebody judges it, they observe something, they then interpret it and they make a judgment on it, they evaluate it, and they will go, well, that's just completely irrational. Why would they do that? And it's well, actually, to the person who's made that decision, the person that you're labeling as irrational, to them, what they're doing is perfectly rational. And it's this predictably irrational piece. I mean, I know within the security industry, we sometimes label people who don't necessarily comply with an organizational policy as being irrational because why would they do that when they know that they could potentially, one, get caught, two, if they get caught, it could have an impact upon the organization, customers, society, but it could also mean that they get disciplined. And that might be something as little as a slap on the wrist, or it could be something as extreme as, losing your job or even potentially being taken to court. So we sort of like say, well, surely they're being irrational if they decide to do that. But actually, in the mind of that individual, they've rationalized it. And that sometimes that process of rationalization actually is operating at an unconscious level. And part of that is all about the cultural values that are at play, that person has grown up with over the years.
And also the people for whom these cultural values are important. So you can often hear people say, I actually just did it to make my parents proud. even if those parents are dead and gone. So that can also help. So who am I really performing for? Is it children? Is it my parents? Is it my country? Is it the boss of my organization? So yes, actually, I think the last statement you made also, Bruce, was a very good one. And moreover, there are some people entering here, so I think we should start rounding off.
Wrapping up. Yeah. Well, look, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on the show, and thanks for sharing your insights with the community. And always great to talk to. Always great.
Well, I hope this is going to be useful for some people. And Bruce, it's a pleasure talking to you as always. Okay. So goodbye.
All right. Take care. Ciao. Bye.
Cheers.
So every time I have a chat with Gert Jan, it's an absolute pleasure. And, we'll try and touch base also in between interviews as well. I really enjoy his Dutch sense of, just being pretty straight to the point about things. It's absolutely fantastic. And we do have a bit of a giggle about the pickle that the UK and Europe are in over Brexit as well. So great to have him on the show. I think what we did really well this time around is, in series 1, when we had our first chat, we spoke about the 6 power dimensions, which are really important to me and my work. But we know we've been able to build upon that a little bit more. For me, it's really interesting to sort of introduce Gert Jan to the fact that there are other guests that have been using his work. I mean, Char Sample, for example, great example where you've got somebody who, Char is an immense force when it comes to research within the security community. And for the fact that she's actually referencing the work that Gert Jan has been doing as a core part to her own research just tells you how important this person is, how influential they are. So to have him on the show twice on the podcast, has been absolutely fantastic. So I'm really, really pleased that he was able to come and share some further insights with you all today. So if you like that sort of stuff, if you're new to the show, or even if you're not new to the show, and you like that sort of stuff, and you want to know more, well, how can you do that? Well, every year I have a training program where we look at workshops and courses, and you're more than welcome to come and join us on those. And in the workshops, we really, really push ideas around, many of them influenced by the type of people that we have on the show, many of them influenced by a whole range of people that I still haven't been able to get on the show, but hopefully at some point in the future, we will be able to do that. But then it's also about, how do I apply this stuff within the context of the challenges I face within my organization? And, the workshops can help you with that, but also the courses as well are a very structured way of doing that. So you sort of have free-flowing thinking workshops, which then move into a more structured, okay, so, I'm getting this in my head, but what are the principles I need to be applying here? What are the processes involved here? What is the framework like? So if you're really interested in this stuff and you think it could be applicable to you and what you do day in, day out, then please go to www.marmaladebox.com /training, and you can find out about the courses and the workshops that we run there. If you loved the podcast today and you want to know, when is the next one coming out? How do I stay best informed? Well, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. The first one is to subscribe to the podcast, which you can do at www.marmaladebox /podcast. There's a number of different ways that you can do it there. We lay that all out for you. A great way to do it is if you're on LinkedIn, is to come along, send in a request to join the LinkedIn group. So the group is growing. We're starting to create some discussions, debate. We're regularly posting on a weekly basis. So if you want to get involved with that, join the group, then LinkedIn is an option for you. So I trust that you found that really interesting. It's an absolute pleasure to have Gert Jan back on the show. I'm sure in Series 3, he'll be up for coming back on as well. But we're also looking at introducing you to a range of other people who sort of have a specialism in terms of culture at quite a deeply research-driven level, but also research that's been applied within organizations as well. So, keep tuned in if you want to know more about the role of culture and how cultures are formed and influenced, so that it helps you to understand how you can embed information security into your organizational culture in a way that is truly valued. So thanks very much for joining us on the show. Been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Really look forward to getting to having you join us on the next podcast that we publish, which we should be in about 2 weeks. So in the meantime, have a great time, and hope to hear from you soon. Take care. Bye.